Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Tonight, we will be talking about triggers and hair pulling. My idea for tonight is to talk about different kinds of triggers, um, to see what is it that we can do with triggers, and also to talk a little bit about why is something a trigger in the first place. So these will be some of the topics we will be discussing. If you haven't voted for the topic for April, check out the poll now. I will close it once I finish the talking part of the webinar before the Q&A, so that if you have to leave earlier so that you know what the topic will be next month. If there are some topics that you would like me to talk about, put them in the Q&A as well, and I will write them down and then let you vote on those next time. So let's get started. Okay, so more or less, I think I already said everything that's written here. These are some of the topics that we will be exploring. And in the end, as always, it's the Q&A part. So let's start, as always, by defining, what is it that we're talking about? So what is a trigger? What are we talking about when we're talking about triggers? A very generic way of defining triggers is any event that activates a behavioral pattern. So we can talk about triggers for hair pulling or triggers for really anything else. In fact, even behaviors that we like and find desirable also have triggers. So something has to activate them. In the case of hair pulling specifically, a trigger is any event that allows the urge to arise or that immediately causes people to pull. Because sometimes the whole sequence is so fast that you don't have the period when an urge builds up. So it's anything that will cause the urge to appear or anything that will cause you to pull. As you can see, when we define it that way, a lot of things can be triggers. I decided to make a list for myself, and just based on what my clients tell me every day, what typically is a trigger. And so this is the list. So just it's a huge list. So some of the common ones are anxiety, boredom, very frequently, conflict with others, coarse hair, split ends, guilt, shame. Social media can trigger people, working, seeing a mirror, or rather your reflection in the mirror. Even happiness sometimes can cause people to pull. When we talk about intense emotions as triggers for pulling, we most frequently focus on the negative side of the experience. So on emotions like guilt or shame or anxiety or anger. And it's not even that rare that it's also the positive emotions that can trigger people to pull. This is because what we usually react to is the intensity of the emotion, not necessarily just to the quality. I'm sure that if you see this list, you can add, every one of you can add at least one or two things or even more that are not covered. Sometimes triggers can be very, very specific. So it's very difficult to create a kind of full nomenclature of triggers for anything, and of course, obviously for hair pulling. However, I do like to classify and organize things. I like it when there's structure to something. So I thought about what is it that these triggers share and how is it that my clients and I usually talk about triggers. So I came up with a way. It's not a universal classification. It's not something that you will find in books. It's just something that clinically makes sense to me and has been useful. So this is how we can classify all these. The most obvious kind of superficial level classification would be something internal versus something external. If you just go back to the list here, some of them are internal, like boredom. That's a kind of an emotional state, right? Or at least an intense feeling. Being overwhelmed, also internal. Guilt, shame, also internal. On the other hand, coworkers or public speaking or even split ends can be external. I guess once we get into the topic in more details today, you might realize that all of them are ultimately internal. But when you start the kind of the first part of therapy, like the beginning when you're just getting to know pulling, this external versus internal classification is really very, very useful. Because this is the first thing that we usually notice. Like, is it something that I see or is it something inside of me? Right. So Internal triggers can be emotional or cognitive. So it can be the way you think about something, or it can be the way you feel about something. External triggers can be objects, for example, like when you see a mirror or a reflection in the mirror, or when you see, if you use any tools for pulling, sometimes seeing those tools can trigger the urge to pull. Other people can be triggering for you, or obviously behaviors. Sometimes, especially with people who struggle with trauma as well as hair pulling, sometimes even a gesture can really trigger an intense response. So external triggers can be a variety of things for different people. They can be self-focused or they can be other-focused. When I say this, I specifically mean those triggers like being assessed by people, or public speaking, or shame or guilt. So it can be about the way you will be perceived by other people, which and that can trigger you, or it can be the way you will see yourself. And then if you see yourself in a certain way, you might be tempted to pull. And then, of course, they can be situated in the present, or they can be imaginary as triggers. Um, Situated in the present, originally I wanted to call it, real triggers versus imaginary triggers. But then for a variety of theoretical reasons, I decided to go against it. So it can be, a trigger can be something that's just right here. It could even be me now when I'm talking about triggers. I hope I'm not, but it's not impossible. So that would be a present trigger, something that's unfolding right now. But a good portion of our triggers, especially those triggers that have to do with the way we think or feel, are actually in a way imaginary. We can be afraid of failing an exam that's, let's say, 2 weeks from now. In that case, the trigger hasn't really happened yet, right? So you're triggered by your fears of something that will happen. So in that sense, a trigger is actually imaginary, because the exam is not, you're not in the situation of taking the said exam. I hope that distinction makes sense to you. So the reason why I chose these categories once again is because this is something that these are the distinctions that usually my clients start making at a certain point in our work together, and also something that I, through my experience, thought it would be useful to ask or consider. Very frequently, sort of how we classify these triggers determines also how we deal with them and what we do with them. You're not going to, uh, even on a very kind of specific, concrete, technical level, you are probably not going to approach a triggering thought the same way you would approach a mirror, right? So you need a different technique. When in habit reversal training, which is like the basic kind of proven old behavioral intervention for hair pulling, we use those competing responses, and we often talk about those in webinars as well. So if you use a competing response, for example, a stress ball, that makes sense in certain situations, but then if your trigger is emotional, maybe something else will work better than maybe something like a breathing exercise. Right? Ultimately, your experience with techniques is the ultimate judge of how well they work. But knowing these kinds of ways of classifying triggers can be really helpful, so that you can orient yourself in terms of finding a solution for them. What triggers one person may not be a trigger for another. In addition, triggers can change over time. So what used to be a trigger, I don't know, 3, 4, or 5 years ago, may not be a trigger now, and obviously vice versa. Discovering triggers is, I would say, for most people, it's quite easy, especially the external triggers. People see something and then they pull, and it's easy to remember. Those triggers that I called internal are slightly more difficult. And this is one of the reasons why I usually start from there in therapy, because it takes some time. That means you have to become aware of what you're thinking, and you have to be aware of what you're feeling in order to determine how these thoughts or feelings trigger you. Right. So usually we go about discovering triggers by doing two things at once. One would be to look back at your history with pulling and to consider all these things that used to be triggers in the past. And then another way to go is to self-monitor now in real time. In TrichStop, we use the self-monitoring app, but you can use it also if you're not in the program. It's a free app. But that's what we use because it's kind of structured and organized and it gives you a lot of good data. Now, the reason why I like to use both of these approaches is because if you do self-monitoring for 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, you will certainly start recognizing a lot of triggers. However, in any given period of time, you will experience only certain triggers, especially nowadays when most of us are in one way or another isolated from the rest of the world because of COVID. It's quite difficult to identify all those triggers because our lives are a little smaller than they normally would be. So certain areas of our lives are neglected, and therefore we may not really have the experience of being triggered by some of these things. So that's why when you're starting to discover triggers, you should kind of look back at your entire history with pulling and then isolate those, let's say, historically relevant triggers, because they will not be the same ones that you discover from day-to-day self-monitoring. I suppose if you're working on your own, you can start with whatever seems easier. Sometimes it's much easier to look back at the past first and then identify what the major triggers were and then start working on the present. But ideally, you will combine the two approaches and do both. So let's see now, why is it that triggers trigger? This is the part of the evening where I mentioned Kelly. So in constructivist psychology, everything tends to be a little different and skewed as opposed to, let's say, most of mainstream psychologists. So triggers aren't really just triggers. In fact, for Kelly, nothing is really what we think it is or what it is, let's say. So everything that we see, feel, perceive with our senses represents itself. So if I'm talking about, I don't know, I have my cell phone here. So my cell phone is my cell phone, right? But at the same time, my cell phone is also a representation of whatever experiential mental category I put it in. So the object is what it is, but it's also what I see it as. I hope this distinction is clear. I gave an example here, which is more of a joke than an example, but in constructivism, a cigar is never just a cigar. It's always what it is, a cigar, plus everything else that you can possibly see in it. So essentially, if we say that, let me take an example. Let's say that you're triggered to pull by seeing split ends, for example. So a split end is a split end, right? That's not exactly brain science to figure out what a split end is. But at the same time, a split end is also whatever it is that it means to you. So it's the actual hair, but it's also a construct in which you put it. A construct seems like a very abstract word, but it's just one way for us to designate all these kind of binary categories that we place events in. Our minds always classify stuff. And these boxes that we classify things in, that's what we call constructs. And then these boxes tend to be connected to each other. And it's how they're connected that determines what something means to us. So meaning is never kind of outside in the world. It's always in our minds. I hope that makes sense to you. So let me give you an example, something that's kind of shared, because constructs arise from our experience. So every person will have different ones. Sometimes we share constructs because our culture embeds them in us when we're very little. So let's say good versus evil. That would be one construct that most people have. It may or may not be relevant in your life at a given time, but it's a distinction that most of us can make. So maybe we can debate what exactly is good and what exactly is evil. So we will debate about the elements, right? We can put them on one side or the other side or somewhere in the middle, but the category is something that we all share. And then from time to time, you will hear people who say that they kind of don't believe in good and evil, and yet at the same time, they always use the language of good and evil. So a couple of months back, I was reading and exploring something about sort of neo-paganism for a client. So I'm a nerd, and whenever I have clients who have belief systems that are not something that I'm acquainted with, I just kind of go on a deep dive and try to understand it, because these things are usually very important to people. So it is obviously important to me to know what my clients believe in. And so I was reading a text about this, and a person who was practicing a specific religion said that in paganism there is no good and evil, because there's a little bit of good in everything and then a little bit of evil in everything. And I remember distinctly kind of smiling a little bit, because I knew what the person wanted to say. It was kind of instinctively, uh, it made sense to me. But at the same time, you can't say there is no good and evil, because there's a little bit of good and a little bit of evil, because you're using the same construct. So constructs work like that. We can't really escape them. They literally shape the way that we see reality. I mean, they come about from our interplay with the world, but they shape how we see the world. It's kind of like wearing glasses. I'm very, very blind. So when I take my glasses off, I can't even read the title of the slide. And then when I put them back, I see it well. But if my glasses are not clean, or if I use sunglasses, I will see colors slightly differently. And this is exactly how constructs work. They basically color a part of our world in a certain shade. So for Kelly, when you say that something is a trigger, you're actually referring to whatever you see as the trigger plus the filter that you put on it. So those two things would make a trigger combined. I hope that that makes sense. And it's those constructs that determine how we will deal with something. They give us tools to handle the world, basically. Like, think about it. If you have good and evil, let's say, and then you classify something as good or you classify something as evil, you will immediately know whether or not to engage with that, let's say, a person. Because if they're evil, unless you see yourself as evil too, you will likely step aside. Right? So a construct gives you directions on how to treat something. Construct is like they give you instructions. In slightly simpler terms, as Stoics used to say, that we are affected not by events, but how we see those events. So that would be the simplest way to put it. In fact, it's so simple that I'm pretty sure that Kelly's rolling over in his grave, but for the sake of our webinar, let's stay with this. So the reason why something triggers us is because that something means something to us. And at this point, I think it's very important to make one more distinction, and then I promise we're almost done with theoretical terms. And that distinction is between language and meaning. It's a complicated topic, but in Kelly's theory, when we talk about language, we're actually talking about elements of constructs. So a word doesn't carry meaning. It's the structure, it's the box in which we put that word, basically. And there are certain constructs that we can very easily express with words, like good versus evil. That's something, those words are very easy to think of. When you see, I don't know, something on TV, I don't know, like there was a mass murder recently, right? So when you see that, it doesn't take a long time for you to say, well, then that's not good, that's evil, right? Because when we put something into words, then it's much easier to manipulate those terms. But when constructs are just feelings, that's where things get a little complicated, because we're either because of the way that our brains were built, or because of the way that our culture is set up, or because of both, as it usually happens, we deal much better with words than we do with sensations and feelings. But from a theoretical point of view, in constructivism, it's all the same thing. So when we say what something means to us, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily easily articulate that with words. In fact, if we could, most of the time we would resolve the problems ourselves. We would not go to therapy, right? So we basically go to therapy when words fail us. So let's consider it further. So hopefully by now you understand what constructs are. You understand that they're connected to each other, right? So just imagine baskets connected to each other. Well, they're not just standing next to each other. They're kind of hierarchically organized. So there are some that are on the bottom, and then there are some that are a bit higher. It's kind of like a pyramid, like the one on the image here. So why is this important for us? When we look at the bottom of the pyramid in Kelly's theory, usually you find less important and more concrete constructs. And then as you climb up, they become more important and more abstract in nature. This is not always the rule. The more important, less important thing is, so that's always the same. The higher up you go, the more important they are. They tend to be more abstract, but it's not necessarily the case for everyone. But let's not complicate things for now. What does this mean? When you say I'm triggered by seeing a split end, since I already started with that one, let's just roll with it. A split end is a very concrete, specific thing. So it's something that belongs at the bottom of the pyramid. And then you may wonder, if it's at the bottom of the pyramid, so it's not as important, why on earth is it so intense? And why is it that it triggers us to pull? So the reason is that those constructs at the bottom of the pyramid are by proxy connected to those on the top. And triggers have like a VIP access to the top. They just immediately go up there. They don't have to climb every step. They just fly up. It's like they have an elevator from the bottom of the pyramid all the way to the top of the pyramid. And why is it important that they're at the top of the pyramid? Because the higher up they reach, so as high as their meaning goes, that tells us how intense our reaction will be to them. Because those constructs, those baskets that are on the very top of the pyramid, make up, let's say, our identity, our sense of self. So basically, something very, very tiny, like a split end, can ultimately shake us to our core. So when people say, why am I triggered by this little insignificant, stupid thing? It's because for us, psychologically speaking, it's not a stupid little insignificant thing. It's something that literally attacks our sense of self. It really just disturbs who we are as people. We had a webinar on perfectionism, and this is one of the things that you can very easily notice in perfectionist thinking. One little thing can immediately make you a horrible person and a complete failure. Even if 99.9% of the things are good, that one little thing at the bottom of the pyramid just ruins everything. So the key question when we think about triggers and when we try to understand triggers is, what does this mean to me? And think also, what does this mean to me may not necessarily be expressible with words. So an example, clients are often triggered by potential conflict. I've noticed this across the BFRB spectrum, that very frequently people will say that not even an argument with someone is triggering, but the mere thought of having an argument with someone. Because disagreement potentially leads to rejection. For some people, this could mean basically, after all, you're not good enough. So conflict itself wouldn't be a trigger if it didn't mean you're not good enough. In fact, it is a trigger because that's what it means. If we change the meaning of this, then we will also change the way we react to the trigger, or rather, something that's a trigger will no longer be a trigger. When I put it like this is an example that I think a lot of people can relate to. However, in clinical practice, people are not as simple. So we don't all share the same constructs. We don't always use the same words to describe situations. And this is why I'm often reluctant or just flat out refuse to give any universal recipes for things. Take this as an example and then roll with it and apply it to yourself. Adjust it, change it, see how it fits you. Because that's the most important thing. Because the meaning is always yours. Let's look at a slightly more complicated example, just so that you can see roughly how that would work in psychotherapy. So this is, obviously this is highly reductionist, but I just kind of have to arrange it in some way from a real life client that I'm working with at the moment. So she says she reviews the self-monitoring log and sends it to me. And we both see the same repeating pattern, which is work, 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 work. So basically her main trigger is work. So I ask, what is it about work that triggers you? Because work is very vague. That means 8 hours a day at least can trigger you. You know what I mean? Like work is far more complex to just say work as a trigger. But then she says, well, there's nothing there. I just pull at one point. And then I ask her about her day. So what kind of, pardon me, what kind of work is it that she does? So she works from home because of COVID, as most of us do. So I say, okay, but what is it that you do? And then she says, well, I just work with Excel sheets and tables and graphs and such. So I said, okay, so then you're sitting the whole day, right? And then she says, yes, I am. So I say, what do you feel in your body when you're sitting? And then she'll, responds back and says, well, what do you mean what I feel in my body? My body is just there. And so I instruct her to pay more attention to what happens in her body as she works during the day. She comes back one day and says, well, I didn't really notice anything except the fact that my lower back hurts, which is obviously because she's sitting all day. So I just kind of responded, I typed back messages saying, okay, so maybe you feel uncomfortable. And she says, well, maybe I do. So I said, okay, pay attention to that feeling. Let's see what it means to feel uncomfortable. Like what's the experience like? And then she comes back, I feel trapped in my body. I ask for a description and then I get it. Uh, Her lower back hurts, her shoulders hurt, her neck hurts. She feels like her body's becoming very, very firm, and it's almost like it's preventing her from actually moving freely. So there's something inside of her, or at least that's how she describes it. There's something inside of her that really wants to move around, but the tension of her muscles kind of keep her in one position, and that's incredibly uncomfortable. So I ask about thoughts, and I get more or less what I summarized here, which is I must work faster. She works 8 to 10 hours a day, and yet she doesn't really think that's enough. She doesn't feel very efficient. Working from home is difficult, so she kind of is making herself work more. So she feels trapped. She tells herself, you have to work more, you have to work more. She feels even more trapped. She keeps, and then when she feels trapped, the quality of her work obviously isn't as good because she's not as focused. And then the more the quality of her work drops, she kind of hammers on, well, you must work better, you must work more. And so basically she creates a kind of vicious cycle here. So we now understand this, but we still have to figure out the constructs. We have to figure out what it means, right? So I summarize it for her like this. You're trapped at work. So you're trapped in work, like in the process of working, but you must work even more. So she says yes. And then she responds with, it basically boils down to, do I choose to be cruel to myself or abandon my standards? So she can either torture her body by sitting there, even when her body really doesn't want to be sitting there, or she can abandon whatever standards she set for herself. Just to give you a little more context, we're dealing with a person that has exceedingly high standards from herself, and only from herself and not from anyone else. So basically, there are two constructs here that are important. One is cruel versus kind. So I didn't make up the kind part. I asked her, what is the opposite of cruel? She said, well, if I'm not cruel, then I'm kind. So basically, that would be one construct. So cruel versus kind. And then the second one would be doing something perfectly or simply not being good enough. And it's very interesting the way that she phrased this. It was not for her work not to be good enough, it's for her as a person not to be good enough. Right? So when she says, I must work faster, it's not because she cares about the work that's being done, it's because she's terrified of feeling like she's not good enough. And what happens here is they have two different layers of meaning applied to the same thing, which is her sitting at her desk and working. And then these constructs are kind of connected, like the desirable part of one construct is connected to the undesirable part of the other one, and then also vice versa. So they're kind of crossed. So what does this mean, basically? She can choose to be not good enough, but kind to herself, or to be cruel to herself and then potentially be perfect. So whatever she does of the choices or the alternatives that she set for herself, she's bound to make one wrong choice. So she can choose whether to be guilty for this or for that, to be anxious about this or be anxious about that. So whatever she does, she did it wrong. And then needless to say, this alone can generate so many negative emotions that it easily triggers you to pull. So it's not work as in her sitting at her desk and typing and doing her charts and graphs. It's really what it means for her is that at the same time, she's trying to achieve perfection, but the price is cruelty. And that's what it means for her. And that's why it's triggering. I hope this made sense to you. So the bottom line here is that when we work psychologically and when we want to change something, we don't focus so much on the trigger itself, so work. Rather, we focus on the constructs. If you change the way these constructs are connected, for example, you can get, you can give her more space to breathe. Alternatively, uh, if what she identified as a problem and what that I wholeheartedly agreed with is that perfect versus not good enough is a construct that's always really bound to torture her, because perfect doesn't really exist. Because then when I asked when was anything perfect, she really couldn't give me any information. She thought about one or two events from her life, but then decided that even though they were executed in a perfect way, she still really didn't feel like she was good enough because she felt that those events were basically just luck. So perfect versus not good enough would be a construct that doesn't work. And then what we do is find an alternative, find, let's say, a different story to tell around this construct. That means trying out different things, doing things differently, and then trying to see what works from that experience and then come up with something new. It's a very messy and unpredictable process, but then again, change often is. Remember the example that I gave you about good versus evil as a kind of construct. And then I gave you the example of the pagan practitioner that I was reading about who said that there is no good and evil in paganism, but then they use those exact terms to describe what supposedly isn't there. That's the trick with constructs. They really don't allow us to think outside of the boundaries that they set. So for someone who has a construct perfect versus not good enough, it's very difficult to even think outside of those categories. It can be extremely confusing and extremely anxiety inducing. But the trick of change is precisely that you have to go through the confusion, because in order for you to give birth, let's say, to a different way of thinking, you have to abandon the way of thinking that you have now. And if you abandon the way of thinking you have now, you're bound to end up, obviously, with some degree of anxiety. When we're not able to tolerate our own emotional responses to these triggering situations, what we usually do is that we find strategies to distract ourselves. So hair pulling is one such strategy. We don't have time to get into details on experiential avoidance. We had a webinar on this a couple of months back, so you can go and listen to it if that's something that you want to learn more about. There's another strategy, which is to simply eliminate everything from your life that would potentially be triggering. And this leads to a dramatic reduction in the size of basically the world that we live in. You kind of reduce the world to the size where it works and where everything is comfortable and nice. One very drastic example of this would be outside of pooling, would be, let's say, agoraphobia, which is where someone really reduces their life to wherever they live and they just stay indoors. Because if you eliminate the rest of the world, then your constructs work fine in certain limited circumstances. This may seem like an elegant solution. Unfortunately, most of us really can't live that way. So anxiety is something that always comes with change. And so when you have a challenging situation, anxiety is bound to arise. In fact, one way that we know that experiences are difficult or confusing, or if these experiences are just on the limits of what we can do, is when we feel anxious. Usually when we want to avoid anxiety that it's caused by these triggering situations, we kind of try to remove the element and then we walk away. Like I said, that leads to constriction, to the reduction of our world. The problem with this is that you don't actually change the construct, you just remove the element. It's basically like saying, um, I don't know, I can't stand winter, so I will move to a place where it never snows. Except that in this example, that's usually possible to do. And in fact, I've done it myself because I absolutely hate snow. But at the same time, it doesn't change, the I hate the snow part. And when we talk about things that are our own psychology, it's really hard to escape. So you can remove something that's triggering, but at a certain point in your life, something else is bound to get in there because you have an empty basket, you have a construct that can always take a new element. When we avoid, distract ourselves, or eliminate these things, we actually cement precisely what's wrong with us. So experiential avoidance, not only that it leads to pulling, it also kind of cements the very problem that created pulling in the first place. And then the more you avoid, the bigger the problem is. So from a constructivist point of view, we see our emotions as kind of transitional states. So emotions basically tell you about what's happening in your psyche. They're like the weather forecast of your psychological world. So so it's basically information. It's nothing to be afraid of, nothing that speaks about you as a person. It's just information about what's happening. And so when anxiety arises, basically this is information that we're approaching the end of what our constructs can currently do. So instead of running away from anxiety should actually be an invitation to go in that direction, because it's directly telling you, here it is, a part of reality is approaching, and you don't have any tools to cope with this part of reality. So it should tell you that you should kind of approach it with mindfulness, with care, with tact, with strategy, instead of running away. So when you run away from triggers and when you eliminate them from your world, you're actually kind of cementing them. You're worsening your own situation, so to speak. So from a constructivist point of view, and not just from a constructivist point of view, it's also, so the TrichStop as a program is not based on constructivist theory. Constructivism is something that I profoundly love, and I like to present that point of view. But the basis of TrichStop is essentially CBT, or at least a form of CBT. And in CBT as well, especially in this form, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy, this is also a point that they make. They use a slightly different language. It's less technical and maybe more human, but it is the same point, which is that if we run away from our experiences, we don't change. We have to actually embrace and open up to these difficult experiences so that they can change us. And if you remember 2 slides ago, I said that we cannot really fully think outside of our constructs. That means that when we step into anxiety and start working with whatever it is that's causing us anxiety, new constructs will spontaneously emerge. We will try new things. We will obviously make 7,000 mistakes. But then out of these 7,000 mistakes, some of them will be useful pointers that will direct us and tell us where to go. And then slowly, one step at a time, we will ultimately find a new way to look at things. So what used to be a source of anxiety will no longer be that, once we manage to find good meaning for it. So I'm going to end with a quote by Kelly. It's from one of his essays that were published posthumously. This one is called Language of Hypothesis. It's an excellent essay, but not easy to find. What I'm saying is that it is not so much what man is that counts as what he ventures to make of himself. So basically, here he tells you that constructivism doesn't really much care about guilt other than as information. So it's not about judging yourself or calling yourself names. Whatever you are now is fine, but what really counts is what you will do to change and to become someone else. To make the leap, he must do more than disclose himself. So it's not enough for you to just, kind of unravel and realize and accept what the problem is, he must risk a certain amount of confusion. So you have to be willing to dive into what you don't know, what you cannot conceptualize, and what you cannot think about clearly. It's from confusion that we change. Then, as soon as he does catch a glimpse of a different kind of life, he needs to find some way of overcoming the paralyzing moment of threat, for this is the instant when he wonders who he really is, whether he is what he just was or is what he is about to be. It's kind of like this image here of this person leaping off of the cliff. We can hope that they land to the other side, but no one knows, including the person that's jumping. But they have to take the leap. Otherwise, there's really no chance of them getting to the other side. Of course, in psychotherapy, we do try to make change slightly less life threatening than what you have on the image here. But the reason why it shows that picture is because that's exactly how change feels. It always feels like you're just just jumping off of a cliff, even though in reality, it's not that way. But from our experiential point of view, when we change, when we want to alter meaning, we have to have that moment when we kind of just let go. And then once we cross to the other side, or as the case may be, fall flat down there, uh, then we can assess the experience and then see what we did well and what we didn't do well. But we really have to take that jump. And the same goes when we work with triggers. In order for them to mean anything else, we have to try acting differently with them. And I remember I shared this quote with one client a couple of years ago. And the client said, and we were talking about seeing yourself in the mirror and sort of the ensuing triggering reaction. And the client said, well, yeah, that sounds well and nice, but what you're actually saying is that I should keep looking at myself in the mirror and then feel all this anxiety and this tension and this horror, inside of me, and just keep looking at the mirror and then walk away. And so I responded with yes. And then the next thing is, but the anxiety will become stronger and stronger. And then I respond with probably. And the client says, and then what will happen? And then I ask, well, what will happen? And then the client responds, I will die. And I said, well, will you? And the client says, well, no, obviously I'm not going to die. And I was like, well, there you go. So you know that the jumping off of your cliff just feels like you will jump off of the cliff. But emotion is just information. It's not a death sentence. It's not a threat. It's not a character trait. It's not a moral judgment. It's just something that's happening. And so once we learn how to approach our own psyche in that way, then we can kind of take the leap and triggers will no longer be as triggering. Because just surviving the trigger, very often, I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, but people will often be very, very excited and happy when they feel that something has triggered them and they have the urge to pull, then they walk away and the urge goes away. It's like winning a battle. And these kinds of experiences, even if they don't change us, dramatically right away, because those kinds of changes only exist in movies or BuzzFeed articles that say, here are 7 life hacks that will make you a perfect person in 7 seconds, which really does not work. So we need a lot of these small new experiences, and then ultimately they add up. They give birth to a new way of thinking. The key is to make the leap, to trust yourself that you will survive the leap you're taking. And second, to allow these events to transform you. Constructs give us control. So let's go back to the good versus evil one. Um, when you divide the world into the good side and the evil side, and when that division is very sharp and very black and white, it's very pleasant. It's like it's a good place to be in because you know exactly what's good, what's bad, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. You can just everything seems very clear, and then you have control. Even if you can't exactly control every person, you know what to do with them and how to think about them because you know what basket you're supposed to put them in. If someone is evil, you do this, 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 and this. And this is a very comfortable position. And then we do feel in control, even when what's happening to us is very unpleasant and unpredictable, because the sense of control comes from our ability to anticipate and to predict. And when we have constructs, then we can do that. And when I tell you that change means kind of jumping into confusion, that also means loss of control. And this is why I said that when you open up, you need to allow the events to transform you. When we change, there are these instances when we really can't quite pull our strings together. And as horrible as that sounds, but that's good. Because if our constructs were good, we wouldn't really be in the situation to change them anyway. So letting go of control means that you will not be able to predict exactly how you will see the world, but what you do know is that it's certainly going to be better than the position that you're in. Because even if you land on the other side of where this person is jumping and you don't quite like it there, it's still a new experience that will take you somewhere else. Whereas when you cling to the old constructs, you just stay in a very uncomfortable place, but a safe place. So change is anything but safe. Uh, I will stop here and then we will go to the Q&A. Let me just stop the poll so that we can see what have you selected for April. Let